Solo Leveling by Gong. Bonus Stories 2. Ash continued to fall from the sky like snowflakes. Jinwoo finished saying goodbye to the Shadow soldiers, who he'd have to part with, and faced the leader of the rulers without any hesitation. "I'm ready." The despondent brightest fragment of luminosity summoned a cup. Jinwoo eyed it curiously. So that's the cup of reincarnation, the forbidden tool that can reverse time. Jinwoo found himself swallowing hard as it sank in that it was time to start all over again. His nervousness didn't escape the brightest fragment of luminosity. "Are you sure you won't regret this?" After the countless hours he had spent fighting the monarchs, he knew better than anyone about the burden of war. He also understood the weight the Shadow Monarch would now carry on his own. The second Shadow Monarch nodded. He'd won the war once already, so things would only go better this time around. They would have to. Seeing the resolve and confidence on Jinwoo's face, the ruler nodded in turn. Jinwoo had the resolve to get back what he had lost to the war. As someone who had rebelled against the Supreme Being for the sake of his fallen subordinates, he understood what that was like. "May your courage save your world." With that sincere wish, the brightest fragment of luminosity flipped the cup of reincarnation upside down. The light filling the cup poured out, soaking the earth. The world was bathed in a gleaming light. The soldiers who had sustained injuries on the battlefield, their mournful families receiving reports on the soldiers via TV, those praying for their loved ones' safety, those who felt sick to their stomachs watching the news, those hanging their heads in despair. Everyone saw the bright light coming through their windows from their homes, cars, hospitals, schools, and workplaces. Soon, the world was covered in light. Then, just as the light quickly and quietly engulfed the whole world, it disappeared without a trace. Morning. Through his closed eyes, Jinwoo could feel the sun's rays and the familiar texture of the bedding he lay on top of. Despite not being fully awake, Jinwoo could sense what was going on in his surroundings thanks to his superhuman perception. Jaina coming out of the bathroom after washing up, the sound of cooking and the smell of stew simmering, my scent lingering in my room. He was home. Jinwoo had returned to his home. His heart slowly began to race. Then he heard his mother's voice outside his room. "Jaina, can you wake up your brother?" Right. She was a growing kid, which meant that she loved sleep, but still sprang out of bed in the morning as little kids tend to do. That led to her often waking up her brother per their mother's request. "Hey!" It felt like a memory of his childhood was playing in real time, and a smile formed on his face. Creak. "Jinwoo." Jinwoo slowly sat up before his sister had completely opened the door. "Huh? You're already up?" Jaina blinked in surprise to see him awake. Jinwoo smiled fondly at the sight of her in the doorway. There stood a Jaina who hadn't lost her friends to magic beasts. Jinwoo got out of bed and brushed past his sister to head to the living room. "Good morning, Jinwoo." Hearing footsteps behind her, his mother looked over at him as she prepared breakfast. Jinwoo no longer had to see his mother struggling to wake up from the eternal sleep disease. But there was something else he wanted to see more than anything. Jinwoo heard a newspaper page being turned and looked toward the dining table. His father was quietly reading the paper as he waited on breakfast. Sensing Jinwoo's gaze, he looked up. Jinwoo's breath caught as he and his father made eye contact. "Father!" The word came out of Jinwoo's mouth without him realizing it. Il-One raised an eyebrow, since the Jinwoo he knew usually called him Dad. He noticed that Jinwoo was fighting back tears. Maybe he'd had a bad dream? Il-One walked over to him. "What's the matter, son?" Jinwoo was face to face with his dad and could hear his voice. To Jinwoo, who vividly remembered the sight of his father disintegrating into sand and slipping through his fingers. It felt like a dream. However, it wasn't a dream, but a reality he had to protect by any means necessary. The sorrow in his eyes faded, replaced with fierce determination. His father and mother stood in front of him, looking at him with concern. Jinwoo managed to slap on a smile. "I think I had a nightmare." Right. The nightmare was over. His sister was a young kid, his mother was healthy, and his father was present. He had been given one last chance to make it all right, and he wasn't going to squander the opportunity. He was going to rewrite the future. His steely eyes glinted with resolve. It felt like he'd only returned yesterday, but a week had already passed. He'd yet to find a good time to enter the gap between dimensions. He rested his chin on his hand and looked outside the classroom window in a daze. Baruch called out to him, "My king." "I know." Jinwoo knew that the monarchs who coveted this world were most likely preparing a huge gate on the other side of the sky at this moment. But after having finished a monstrous battle, this felt like a short break. Couldn't he enjoy the peace just a little as a reward? Jinwoo was brought out of his musings by a welcome sound. Ding dong, ding dong. It was the final dismissal bell. The languishing children suddenly perked up, brimming with energy. Jinwoo lit up as well. He might be 25 years old inside, but he'd physically returned to being a 14-year-old kid. After a chorus of goodbyes to their teacher, several boys sporting short styles crowded around Jinwoo. "Hey, Jinwoo! You're coming to the internet cafe, right?" Their excitement was infectious, and Jinwoo laughed and nodded. "Awesome. Hey! Jinwoo is on our team today, okay?" "Huh? What are you talking about?" "He was on your team yesterday. But we also had Jongsik, the worst player ever." "Oh, whatever. We'll take both Jongsik and Minpyo, too, if we get Jinwoo. Rock, paper, scissors." "Fine." Jinwoo had shown off his next-level reflexes and perception when playing an online multiplayer game that was all the rage. At their age, one's video game skills was equivalent to one's popularity among the guys, so everyone was dying to have Jinwoo on their team. The best out of 3 games of rock, paper, scissors turned into best out of 5. The female students not interested in video games rolled their eyes at the fierce match to get Jinwoo on their team. At the back of the classroom, a boy surreptitiously watched the others as he slowly packed his things. He was into video games, but had a hard time making friends. This boy could only watch with envy at the others hanging out as a group. Jinwoo chuckled to himself. He could see things he hadn't been able to see when he was younger. Was it because he was an adult now, or due to his raised perception? This classroom was a microcosm of emotions colliding and commingling. Yay! The kids on Jinwoo's team burst into cheers with no regard as to how they were being perceived. Jinwoo shook his head internally. No wonder girls think boys are idiots. The winners circled around Jinwoo, smiling brightly. "Let's go, Jinwoo!" Jinwoo's response was to point toward the back of the classroom. "I want to team up with him." "Huh?" The other boys turned their heads toward the kid quietly packing his bag. He froze like a block of ice when he realized everyone was staring at him. "Huh? Me? Yeah, you." Seeing the boy's conflicted expression, Jinwoo smiled at him. "Why? You don't want to?" "And no, I do." The boy smiled shyly. Jinwoo picked up his backpack. "Then let's go." The boy nodded as he strapped on his backpack. "Why, yeah." Jinwoo laughed. Just a little. Just a teensy bit longer. If it didn't harm anyone, couldn't Jinwoo enjoy these kinds of moments for at least one more day? If only. His footsteps were light and quite heavy at the same time as he left the classroom with his friends. The sky was painted red as the sun set behind the hill at the back of the school. Jinwoo stopped walking for a minute to take it in. His friends called to him. "Jinwoo, what are you doing? There won't be any seats at this rate." "Geez, so much nagging." "I'm coming." He caught up with them in no time. The boys chattered on about the great match ahead of him. Jinwoo could share in their excitement and anticipation even without taking part in the conversation. As he made his way down the street under the red sky with these friends he hadn't seen in ages, Jinwoo broke into a wide grin. Ever since entering the rift between dimensions, Jinwoo had picked up a new habit. He started keeping a journal of everything he saw and heard on that day. He wasn't necessarily doing it for some grand reason like recording his fight against the monarchs. The rift between dimensions was a void much like the world of eternal rest. This place of nothingness contained only endless darkness, and it was hard to stay sane when not in the middle of battle. However, Jinwoo wasn't journaling for a lack of other things to do. Being able to go through these years in his life a second time made him realize that people's perspectives could change over the years. He realized he noticed things he hadn't in the moment. Jinwoo wanted to see how he would feel when reading his journal sometime in the distant future after his memories of this place grew hazy. Would it embarrass him that he kept a diary? Or would he be filled with regret for not doing better? Or would he perhaps miss this tiresome war? And so he continued to write in the journal when he could. The sound of his pen gliding over paper echoed in the endless darkness. He let out a sudden laugh. "I probably won't miss what happened here, right?" He glanced up at the sea of corpses lying all over the place. Jinwoo had secured another victory in a battle by killing the Transfiguration monarch, who had been giving him a hard time. 27 years had passed since he entered the rift between dimensions. Finally, the end of this long, tedious, and brutal war was nigh. The only enemies left were the Dragon King and his army of destruction. His heart raced at the thought of going home soon. I'm glad that time in here and at home move at different speeds. About 2 years would have passed out there. How much would Jaina have changed? How were his father and mother doing? Should Jinwoo have explained more details to his family? Various worries swirled through his head. No. Jinwoo shook his head to rid himself of those thoughts. It was time to focus on what would be recorded on the final page of this journal. Just then, Bellion approached Jinwoo and bowed. "My lord, it is done. We left no survivors." The Shadow soldiers had come back from inspecting the battlefield to ensure all their enemies were dead. He looked around at his army as they stood in front of Jinwoo and awaited his next command. Jinwoo had given up counting their numbers a long time ago. He smiled, and he closed his journal. Good. He put the journal and pen into his inventory and climbed down from the mountain of corpses he had been sitting on. He'd been looking forward to meeting the first and only being to defeat him since becoming the Shadow Monarch. Sure, he'd won the war thanks to the arrival of the rulers, but Jinwoo had technically lost to the Dragon King. I won't lose a second time. Jinwoo's eyes were ablaze as his heart began to pound in anticipation. Ba-dump, be-a-dump, be-a-dump, be-a-dump. Listening to his heartbeat, Jinwoo was struck with the thought that he might actually miss this fight once it was over. Jinwoo turned in the direction the Dragon King's energy was coming from and summoned his soldiers for the final battle. Arise! At the Shadow Monarch's command, new Shadow soldiers rose from the endless pile of corpses. His 3 marshals, Bellion, Baru, and Igris, stood directly behind Jinwoo. The generals stood behind them, and behind them, an army large enough to blanket the entire continent stood on standby. Despite the air being still, it felt like the winds of war were blowing. Jinwoo closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Upon opening them again, he spoke the words that heralded the end of the war. "It's time to kill the Dragon King." The Dragon King sensed a group of soldiers headed his way that was so large, he couldn't get an estimate of their numbers. The Shadow Monarch had initially favored a hit-and-run tactic, but some time ago, he had switched to fighting them head-on. Instead of running after Jinwoo, the army of chaos found themselves being chased. Finally, the army of destruction was the only one remaining, so it was obvious where the Shadow Monarch would strike next. It would be the last battle. The Dragon King had never thought that the end would be decided by a battle between two monarchs. Nevertheless, it was fitting, as his blood still boiled at the thought of his previous clash with the Shadow Monarch many years ago. One of his subordinates cautiously approached the Dragon King. "Sire!" The Dragon King folded his arms and announced, "Yogman has been killed." The subordinate was taken aback to learn of the Transfiguration Monarch's fate, and he lowered his head. "Sire, perhaps you should move away." "No!" The Dragon King bared his teeth, emanating a blood-red hostile aura. "I am tired of showing my back to the enemy. I will fight him here." The Shadow Monarch had spent more than 20 years hunting down the Monarch's soldiers. They wouldn't give the army of destruction time to reorganize themselves. If they couldn't escape Jinwoo's advance, then the Dragon King preferred to end things right here. The Dragon King made his decision. Prepare for battle. The army of destruction reacted at his command. Ruahair. The dragons, dragonfolk, ancient dragons, and wyverns reared up and let out a massive roar. "Here they come!" The Dragon King turned as he sensed a mass of power moving closer. It was clear how the Monarch's armies had been defeated by the Shadow Monarch all along. What excellent mobilization! The Monarch's armies couldn't have kept up with the Shadow Army's movements, since Jinwoo could transport his soldiers freely. The Shadow Army could instantly approach or pull away, no matter the distance. The Dragon King witnessed the cause of their defeat with his own eyes. The Shadow Monarch quietly rose from the darkness, accompanied by several million incredibly powerful soldiers swayed in darkness. The Shadow Monarch. The sheer presence of the Shadow Army was so forceful that it startled the Dragon King. After dozens of years, the Shadow Army was more powerful than ever before. "Ah ha ha ha!" The Dragon King chortled. "Incredible! Truly incredible, O King of the Dead!" How the tables had turned since their last meeting. The Shadow Army now eclipsed the army of destruction. "I never thought you'd be able to take our entire army. Who knew you'd come this far?" Clad in black armor, the Shadow Monarch stared in silence. He had matured as the Shadow Monarch, clearly much stronger than before. As his base instincts as a wild dragon stirred, the Dragon King itched to rip such a powerful adversary to shreds and devour him. However, it was too early to know whether this feeling was a blessing or a curse. He simply wanted to relish it a while longer. Luckily, the Dragon King had a question he wanted to ask. "Tell me, why did the rulers use the cup of reincarnation? Why did they revive the dead monarchs and the soldiers?" The Dragon King had perished at the hands of the rulers. He vividly remembered the pain from the spears that had impaled him on that day. The loss of their leader was sure to cause the army of chaos to crumble, and the long war between the monarchs and the rulers would end as a victory for the rulers. Even the monarchs had to admit it was a total defeat. But for whatever reason, they had revived all the monarchs, including the Dragon King, by using the cup of reincarnation to reverse time. Since then, The Dragon King had deliberated as to the reason behind their decision, but he'd come up with nothing. Thus, he had no choice but to query the Shadow Monarch, who had been on the side of the rulers. "It was my request." The Dragon King was bewildered at the unexpected answer. "What?" Jinwoo clarified, clearly and slowly. "I asked for this. I asked the rulers to use the cup of reincarnation because I wanted to kill you with my own hands." He was out of his mind. The Dragon King almost spat out a litany of curses, but managed to hold his tongue. The Shadow Monarch had used the forbidden tool to turn back time, just so he could fight 10 million soldiers with a mere 100,000. It made no sense, but at least the Dragon King now knew why the rulers had used the cup of reincarnation, and why the Shadow Monarch had been so proactive. There was no greater reason. "Ha ha! Ha 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 ha!" The Dragon King burst out laughing, shaking his head in disbelief. The Shadow Monarch had wanted to fight the Monarch's armies on his own, and he'd successfully managed to drive them into a corner. The Dragon King couldn't help but respect the Shadow Monarch for doing the impossible. The Shadow Monarch had reached the final hurdle. Would he eat or be eaten? For the first time, the Dragon King wanted to know the name of his opponent. Antares. It was the name given to him by the Supreme Being, and he'd never shared it with anyone until now. "That is my name," the Dragon King earnestly spoke. "What is yours?" The Shadow Monarch deigned to answer the last question the Dragon King would ever ask. "Jinwoo-sung." The Shadow Monarch posed a question of his own. "Do you have anything left to say?" The power of death drifted from Jinwoo's shoulders as a black aura. It was much easier to call upon it in the rift between dimensions, since the place was similar to the world of eternal rest. The Shadow soldiers responded to their monarch. "Ra!" The entire Shadow army cried out. The Dragon King smirked at the noise. What is there left to say? What else did he need to say at the great feast being presented to him? Not at all. The Dragon King and Jinwoo both transformed into the astral bodies of a flaming dragon and giant made of darkness, respectively. The two mountains faced off against each other. Gra! The Dragon King's roar shook the area, and the army of destruction charged forward. Jinwoo wordlessly pointed ahead, and with that, his army of close to 10 million instantly mobilized just as he ran toward the Dragon King at full speed. This reunion with the Dragon King marked the end of a long, long war. Jinwoo had been waiting for this moment. A menacing glow gathered in the Dragon King's mouth. It was time for Jinwoo to show him the result of his cumulative battle experience from both timelines. Time slowed as Jinwoo focused solely on the Dragon King. Just as the breath of destruction left the Dragon King's mouth, Jinwoo gathered his black aura on one fist and swung. In the rift between dimensions, light and darkness collided once more.